You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 11th of September 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, coming to you live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Vincent McAviney. Coming up on today's show,
we're playing with World War III, and we have a president that we don't even know if he's... Where is our president? We don't even know if he's a president.
And just to clarify
they
here...
threw him out of a campaign like a dog. We don't even know.
Well, first of all, it's important to remind the former president you're not running against Joe Biden, you're running against me.
Presidential candidates spar in Philadelphia, but has Trump's campaign fully come off the tracks?
We talk about special relationship. I like to call it essential. Essential for our nations, essential for our people, essential for people well beyond our shores.
As they travel to Ukraine together, are the US and UK's foreign ministers attempting a soft reset of the special relationship? Plus, South Korea's AI military summit produces a blueprint, Spain searches for overtourism solutions, and a roundup of news from the African continent. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Vincent McAviney. Well, last night in Philadelphia, Donald Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris met for the very first time for what is currently their first and only debate of the election. The pressure was on Harris to deliver, and it appeared days of rehearsals paid off, with the VP effectively articulating not only her platform and policies, but also cleverly baiting Trump into a performance riddled with his worst instincts and habits. Let's have a listen to how even Fox News had to concede the night went.
Vice President Harris was clearly well prepared, practiced on the offensive much of the night. Former President Trump did take a lot of the bait that she threw out.
Make no mistake about it, Trump had a bad night. He rose to the bait repeatedly when she baited him, something I'm sure his advisors had begged him not to do.
This what has to be thought of by supporters of Donald Trump and people in that campaign as a disappointment. I got reaction from Republican friends. The two common things were train wreck, and he needs this to end.
To recover from this, this was rough. This was pretty intense at times.
But he missed more opportunities, and he took all the bait and none of the opportunities. She pivoted better.
Did Donald Trump miss a few opportunities? Absolutely.
Tonight, she won.
Sheesh, and that is his own side. Well, joining us now to discuss the debate is Natasha Lindstaedt, Professor of Government at the University of Essex. Natasha, firstly, there was some discussion in the build-up of the debate as to whether it was the right strategy to deal with Trump, whether to ignore him entirely. It seems as though Harris took a middle path of outlining her plans and then baiting Trump into just acting out.
No, exactly. I mean, that was clearly the objective. And prior to the debate, that's why she wanted to have the mics on, because she really wanted Trump to implode, to look terrible, and to really showcase to the American public the way he really is in his worst instincts. And fairly early on, she was able to get him. She was able to goad him. There was a question on immigration, and she pivoted and then started talking about his crowd size and how boring his rallies are. And how
we've got a clip of that.
self-indulgent
We'll play that now so listeners can hear it, because this really did hit his Achilles heel.
People start leaving his rallies early out of exhaustion and boredom. And I will tell you, the one thing you will not hear him talk about is you. You will not hear him talk about your needs, your dreams, and your desires.
Now, that echoes what President Obama did with the hand gesture at the DNC. I mean, this really got under his skin, didn't it?
It did. It definitely triggered him. And from that point on, he was so rattled and unhinged and just constantly on defense. He couldn't really get it together and resorted to one of his usual tactics where he kind of just starts lying. He had this one about immigrants stealing their neighbors' pets and eating them, blue Democratic states, allowing babies to be killed, after they're born. He was accusing Harris of wanting to do transgender operations on illegal aliens in prison. When he was cornered about no one really endorsing him, the fact that she made this attack that his advisors call him a disgrace. he came up with the endorsement of Viktor Orban from Hungary, who's not really a noted Democrat, endorsing him and supporting him. So, I mean, she just kept hitting him, time after time, really showing her skills as a prosecutor. And he was constantly on defense.
And he was constantly rounding back to immigration in all his answers. And at one point, as you've mentioned already, he made this extraordinary claim about dinner menus.
A lot of towns don't want to talk about it because they're so embarrassed by it. In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets of the people that live there.
He really seems to have come unstuck facing off with Harris rather than Biden.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, he really sounded deranged in that clip there. And the weeks preceding the debate, things hadn't been going well for him. He had all these different public appearances where it looked like he was having a meltdown. He couldn't answer questions on policy. He seemed to be just completely caught off guard that it was Biden and not that it was Harris, and not Biden that he was running against, because he felt like he could just coast, that he had done so much better than Biden in the debate that it actually caused Biden to leave the race. And his campaign just wasn't prepared for it, and he wasn't prepared for it. And many commentators in the U.S. are saying that they've never seen a debate so lopsided, or a case where Donald Trump had been on the receiving end of such a public beatdown. She was definitely ready to go, and he just wasn't. He was flat, or he was just going off on tangents that didn't make any sense.
And that issue of sense, there's been some criticism in the US of media outlets sane washing Trump, effectively kind of not showing people, because they didn't want to go back to the trap of 2016 of giving him endless coverage, but that they've overcorrected, that they're not showing enough of how different Trump is compared to 2020 Trump, 2016 Trump, that there has been a definitely decline mentally, age-wise as well in him. And this, for many Americans, wasn't it, was their first experience in maybe a while in watching him at length and seeing what he's like now.
That's right. And there hasn't been as much attention on all of the things he says, often because he just tells so many falsehoods and lies that you can't, fact check while he's, speaking, that some of the media just felt that it was dangerous to constantly put him, on TV. But as a result, there are some Americans that are not seeing his incoherent answers, that are not seeing how much he's just sort of engaging in conspiracy theories. But to some extent, it doesn't matter, because no matter what he does, if he's a convicted felon, no matter what kind of crazy thing he says, his support does not really waver very much. He has had 46 to 48% support regardless. And actually, in 2016, voters said that voted for him, that they didn't really care that much about his debate performances.
And in terms of debates, Kamala Harris's team came out immediately and saying they wanted another one. But Donald Trump, it's unclear, though he did take to the spin room after the debate. That's highly unusual, isn't it?
It is. And that would be normally like surrogates of the candidate might go in there, not the candidate themselves. And he did that because he was trying to get control over the narrative. I think he knew the debate was probably disastrous, and he thought that he could try to change the narrative by saying that was his best debate performance ever. Of course, it wasn't. As you already mentioned, Fox News was trying to figure out some sort of answer to this. And some of them were saying that it was ABC News who hosted the debate that was at fault. But there's no way to really spin this, because it was just such a mess for him.
Natasha, thank you. And I'm going to bring in now in the studio Monocle's radio associate producer, Monica Lillis, who is across the details of a special announcement that came out after the debate, which is making as many headlines, a certain Miss Swift.
Yes, absolutely. The Swifties are really thrilled to announce that she will be endorsing Kamala Harris in the upcoming election.
And it was expected, and it's been much debate about and anticipated, but she's been incredibly tactical with her timings, but also her wordings as to why now.
Well, yeah, totally. So I think, Taylor Swift, she isn't a stranger to endorsing the Democrats. In 2018, she, in her documentary Miss Americana, she came out with quite an emotional response to Donald Trump, as well as the Tennessee Republican Senator Marsha Blackburn. And she wanted to be on the right side of history, as she said. Again, in 2020, she endorsed them. And now she's come out with this really calm, almost demure, if you like, statement, sort of saying, you know what, this is, she's going to be a warrior. She really is a steady-handed and gifted leader, and that's what we need to calm the chaos. And also, she's saying it seems very adult, it's less emotional, it's a real public statement, and that as a voter, she's done her research.
And it's interesting because she comes from the same school as Beyonce at the time. The Chicks, formerly the Dixie Chicks, that was the lesson to musicians. Don't be political, be like Dolly Parton, you want to be a uniter of people. But in that documentary, it's interesting, she regretted not coming forward for Hillary Clinton in 2016. She argues with her father about it. And now she seems to be thinking, she is once again in like an imperial stage of being a pop star, isn't she? She's effectively given the campaign hundreds of millions of dollars of free advertising. I mean, is she going to worry at all that this is going to impact her, or is she kind of transcended that now?
I completely believe she's transcended it. I mean, she's at the pinnacle of her career. She's on the highest selling and grossing tour of all time. I really don't think any political statement, especially towards Kamala, is really going to make much difference, to be honest with you. It's not controversial, but it's considered and it's strategic.
And it is the case for Donald Trump of, look what you made me do. You dragged me directly into this with your AI. Well, Natasha Lindstaedt previously and Monica Lewis, thank you very much. Now here's Carlotta Rebello with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Vincent. Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian has travelled to Iraq today on his first visit abroad. Pezeshkian, who was elected in July, met Iraqi Prime Minister Mohammed Shia al-Sudani at the start of a visit that Baghdad said would include the signing of a number of agreements and discussion of the Gaza war and the situation in the region. Mexico's Senate has given general approval to a sweeping judicial reform that will overhaul the country's judiciary. The bill has triggered protests and strikes, with demonstrators breaking into the building where the vote was taking place. And Indonesia has kicked off a Japan-funded expansion of its capital's train network. Indonesian President Joko Widodo launched construction today for a new line on Jakarta's mass rapid transit system, funded by a loan of nearly $1 billion from Japan in a bid to alleviate traffic congestion. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Vincent.
Thanks, Carlotta. Now, yesterday, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken visited Britain's new Labour government in London for the first time. And today he's travelled on to Ukraine with Foreign Secretary David Lammy for meetings with President Zelensky and other senior officials. It's the first joint UK-US trip of its nature in a decade, designed to underline the closeness of the two nations. But there are some disagreements bubbling underneath. Joining us now is Latika Burke, editor-at-large for The Nightly, who attended their joint press conference yesterday. Latika, welcome to the studio. Firstly, how did the meeting go yesterday, and what was the chemistry like at the press conference?
Actually, surprisingly good. This is something I was really keenly aware of and keen to observe, because there had been a bit of a prelude in disagreements on this relating to arms sales to Israel, which I know we'll get to in a second. But actually, the pair of them walked in. David Lammy gave a very warm welcome. And I thought what was very noticeable was Antony Blinken really rushing to embrace the Starmer government, praising Keir Starmer for having hit the ground sprinting, not even running. He upgraded that moniker of the special relationship to the essential relationship, which I thought was
quite a statement there.
Yeah, I thought that was quite a nice line. And that line had not been said before, notably while the Tories were in power. And then they made this very rare step of saying, actually, we're going to pre-announce not just our travel to Ukraine, but the fact that we're doing it together. And one of the interesting aspects of that was when Antony Blinken spoke about it compared to David Lammy. He said that he was representing not just the transatlantic support for the war in Ukraine, but also the Indo-Pacific. And I thought that was a really interesting arc, that he seemed to be standing there saying, I also represent the Indo-Pacific. You, Europe, you, Britain, cannot divorce what's happening in the European theatre from what might happen in the Indo-Pacific.
And on that health of the relationship over the last decade, we've had a Conservative government in for 14 years. David Cameron was quite close to President Obama. They had disagreements about Libya. But since then, the health of it's not been great. America didn't want Brexit. They saw the UK as a great bridge with the European Union. They didn't trust Boris Johnson whatsoever. it was very clear that Joe Biden had no time for Liz Truss at all, openly criticising her at times. So this relationship needed a bit of rejudging, didn't it?
I think Europe has been critical in that, Vincent, and that was one thing that Antony Blinken was also quick to stress. We support what you're doing with Europe. We support you, the British Labour government, trying to forge this closer security relationship with Europe. Now, we'll see if any of that materialises, of course, but that is something that the Labour government has stressed as its, I guess, first few weeks of diplomacy, with Keir Starmer travelling to France, travelling to Germany. We can have a debate about whether that was wise, given the weakness of the leaders in those countries, but it has always been at the core of this government that they want to prioritise the European relationship without getting themselves into a mess again about Brexit and closer relations.
Now, onto those two sort of dividing lines at the moment. You have the UK having suspended some licences for weapons to Israel, and you also have this slight disagreement with the UK and France pushing to allow Ukraine to use long-range weapons into Russia. President Biden's still very cautious on that one. Both leaders have said in Kyiv today. Do you think we're going to see any movement on this?
Yes, I do. I thought it was very, very interesting to see Antony Blinken pressed immediately on this during their press conference. And for the first time, he didn't say, no, we're not getting involved in that. We think what they have is adequate in terms of Ukraine's capability. What he said is there are a couple of factors that determine this decision about whether or not to allow long-range missiles for use inside Russia, and that is whether the Ukrainians are capable of using this equipment, whether they can maintain it, and then thirdly, he said, and whether it fits the strategic objectives. Then he said, that's why we're going to Kyiv to meet President Zelensky. There's a new foreign minister in town there that they'll be meeting with as well. We will be listening intently, was his word, to understand this moment that Ukraine is in. And then he said, more interestingly, both of us will report back to our leaders, Joe Biden and Keir Starmer, and Keir Starmer and Joe Biden are meeting in the White House on Friday. I don't think it's going to be immediate, but I do think we are seeing the start of some movement. And this has been the pattern, and some might say the criticism that is warranted of the Biden administration's approach to Ukraine. Things are red lines until they're not. And then once you've breached the red lines, it's, well, why did we ever have that red line in the first place? So expect to see a bit more of that. But of course, we know that time is running out because the US presidential is very soon, and we have two very contrasting approaches about how each side would deal with the Ukraine war. If it's President Trump, we know, as of the debate last night, he doesn't want to necessarily see Ukraine win. He just wants the war ended. Whether or not that's favourable to Putin is irrelevant to him, it would seem. Very interestingly, Kamala Harris didn't exactly outline either how she would differ or continue the Biden administration's approach to the war in Ukraine.
It was a really interesting line because she said, you know, there's 800,000 Polish Americans here in the state of Philadelphia or Pennsylvania, and they're watching closely because you are happy for Putin to run amok across Europe. Very interesting. We'll see as well, of course, if Keir Starmer gets a meeting with Kamala Harris, because that would be quite something.
Well, so far we think no. Well, so far. We'll see, but it's doubtful.
Yeah. Latika Burke, thank you. You are listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You're back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Now it's time for a roundup of news from the African continent. Joining us is Phil Clark, Professor of International Politics at SOAS, the University of London. Phil, thanks for coming on the show. Firstly, Mpox in the DRC. What's the latest?
So the latest, Vincent, is that the DRC has just received 50,000 Mpox vaccine doses from the US government. This is a few days after the European Union delivered 100,000 Mpox doses. I think that I've just come back from Rwanda, where there's been a huge amount of concern about the spread of Mpox across Central Africa. And one of the real sources of anger in the region has been yet again how slow the global north has been to deliver any kind of medical assistance in the outbreak of another pandemic. So this, of course, has real resonance with that feeling of abandonment during the COVID pandemic. So this is a very small number of doses for Mpox that Congo has received, both from the US and the EU. It's a very tiny amount in the context of the number of people potentially affected by it, but much reporting in the Congolese press today about this latest assistance from the US.
And turning to Sudan now, rebels posting self-incriminating videos of arson and torture online. Presumably there are legal experts around the world gathering these up for any future cases.
Indeed. This is a report in The Guardian today, Vincent, about the Rapid Support Forces, this paramilitary organisation that's been wreaking havoc in the Darfur region of Western Sudan over the last year or so. The Guardian's reporting that the RSF rebels have been posting these really graphic images that seem to indicate evidence of the RSF's arson and torture, particularly against the Masalit ethnic group. It's a predominantly black African group in Darfur that has been targeted by the Sudanese government for the last 20, 25 years. In the latest violence, they've been targeting by the RSF. There are many legal experts suggesting that this may again be an attempt at genocide of the Masalit. And so now we're seeing the RSF post these very graphic videos. And I guess a lot of legal experts do wonder whether these videos may constitute some sort of legal evidence should there ever be a court case into this particular violence in the future. It's, of course, I guess, got all sorts of resonances with what we've seen with the Israeli army in Gaza, just how much this online video evidence of crimes ends up in the courtroom and ends up becoming the sort of evidentiary centerpiece of these kinds of cases. So we do seem to be seeing something very similar in the Darfur context at the moment.
And finally, the UK's new Labour government has abandoned this Rwanda policy, but Germany seems to be looking to adopt it. This is sending migrants to Rwanda, where they will be essentially processed, and then if their asylum is granted, they'll live in Rwanda, not actually Germany.
This was the talk of the town when I was in Kigali last week, that hot on the heels of the UK abandoning its migration deal with Rwanda, it does seem that the German government may be looking to do a similar kind of deal with the Rwandan state. There was a huge delegation of German officials coming through town, talking about trade deals with the Rwandan government, but in particular talking about a potential migration deal. The German government's been very cagey about this in the European press in the last couple of days, but the feeling in Kigali was that there's real momentum now for Germany to try to do something similar to what the UK decided not to do, which is really to end up with asylum cases not dealt with on German territory, but rather being outsourced to the Rwandan state. The bit of this deal that we're not sure about yet is if it goes ahead, whether that would mean that asylum seekers from Germany would end up living in Rwanda, or whether simply their cases would be assessed in Rwanda. But I should also say that it's not only Germany that's looking to do this kind of deal with Rwanda. The Danish and the Austrian governments have also had delegations in Kigali recently. So I think we're looking at a global trend here of European states really not wanting to deal with refugees and asylum seekers on their own territory, but rather wanting to outsource these kinds of questions to much poorer states. And in this case, it looks like Rwanda may be one of the hosts of this kind of deal.
Phil Clark, thank you. You're back with the briefing on Monocle Radio. Now, representatives of some 60 nations gathered at a summit in South Korea have endorsed a blueprint for action to govern responsible use of AI in the military. The United States was among them, but crucially, China led roughly 30 other nations who did not support the legally binding document. Joining us now is Paul Rogers, Open Democracy's international security expert. Paul, thanks for coming on the show. Firstly, this summit was pretty groundbreaking, wasn't it?
It was, in a way. There was a sort of a pre-summit in the Netherlands last year, but this was a more major one because that was, in a sense, a kind of call to action. This was trying to start setting the actual guidelines, so it does make it rather different. It is certainly new. I mean, we're dealing with, well, the title is Responsible Artificial Intelligence in the Military Domain. The idea is you try and set some kind of advice or even agreement as to how to proceed on issues relating to AI in the military domain. And of course, this is something which behind the scenes caused a great deal of concern because of the potential for AI to enable particular groups, either countries or just possibly paramilitary groups, to make rapid and unexpected progress. And so this is why you're having this happening. I think one of the lead players in this has been the Netherlands. South Korea also, which hosted this meeting, as we learned, was significant. Others that have come on board of the 60 or so countries at present are Singapore, Kenya, and the United Kingdom. So it's a mixed bunch and fairly representative of much of the world, which I think at this stage is a good thing.
And what does this blueprint say? Because one of the issues as well has been about autonomy of AI to potentially use lethal force. Is that incorporated into this agreement?
It is. I mean, we have a blueprint for action. It's in fairly early stages. The kinds of things that it brings out are the huge importance of risk management. If you're going to try and use AI for any purpose within the military domain, the claim is you have to do very careful risk management to be absolutely clear that things cannot go awry and essentially run away with you. One addition to this year's document is a directive, particularly to prevent AI being used in the spread of nuclear weapons. And as you can imagine, that even there, it is even more important that, in a sense, there is a human connection right the way through. So it is going down rather more to specifics. But as I say, it's still very early days. But there is enough interest and enough concern to bring in about 60 countries that are sort of identify themselves as being interested in this, but another 30 or so haven't come on board as of yet. But that doesn't mean they may not in the near future.
And particularly that issue of nuclear-powered states. I mean, it's pretty critical, isn't it, that all of them sign up? Obviously, China hasn't opted to it this time, but you've got, the UK, the US. Did France sign up, and was Russia present at all at this summit?
Probably would have done, yes. I couldn't tell you offhand, it probably would have done. If you look at comparisons, I mean, taking the nuclear and weapons of mass destruction, there were many negotiations in the 90s to get a chemical weapons convention, which was finally agreed, even though chemical industries were rather sort of hesitant about it. The attempts to get a biological weapons convention, we have one since 1972, with no real inspection procedures at all, no way of actually checking. That was tried for years and years, but never succeeded, so that we don't have a fully strengthened biological weapons convention, because obviously there are huge potentials on the bio side, and there are, in a sense, it's rather similar to artificial intelligence. This is an area where there could be very big developments very quickly, unless you get an international agreement. We never got it for the biological side. It's there. There is a convention which bans them, but you can't actually tell who's doing what. And this is where I think in these early days, it's important to make rapid progress, but at the same time, try and keep as many countries on board as possible. The United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research is pushing this very strongly at present. And they are the people who understand how arms control works. Because although this is not direct arms control, it has a huge relevance to any form of arms control, as you say, particularly coming down to the nuclear dimension.
Well, it'll be fascinating to see where this goes next. Paul Rogers, thank you. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. And finally, we've seen a raft of protests against overtourism this summer, resulting in some local authorities investigating implementing measures like higher tourist taxes and visitor caps. Spain's Cíes Islands introduced one such cap on daily numbers 7 years ago, with visitors now required to obtain a QR code to disembark the ferry. But can this solution be scaled up nationwide to mainland Spain, Europe's second most visited country? Joining us now is Simon Hunter, a Madrid-based freelance journalist. Simon, thank you for joining us. Firstly, the summer season has now drawn to a close. Has there been much reflection in Spain on these pockets of protest and the issues at the core?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think, really the key protest this summer was that one in Barcelona where some of the protesters squirted tourists with water pistols, because the images of that protest really did go around the world. I actually have a little side gig in the tourist sector, and I speak to quite a lot of Americans, and I've had so many Americans comment to me about that about that protest, about their concerns about going to Barcelona on the basis of those images. So within the country, within the sector, there's been a lot of concern about the potential damage that those, in particular, those Barcelona protests did. And of course, we're still facing this almost kind of existential crisis within the tourism sector in terms of like how to go forward. Where do we go from here? Because so much of Spain's economy is dependent on tourism, but at the same time, so many of these really, really popular destinations are very aware that something needs to change. It's not, again, to keep stressing, it's not, these aren't anti-tourist protests. They're demonstrations, they're protests calling for a new model of tourism, and one that is not putting these destinations under such a great strain. We've had some really interesting protests as well. There were a couple of protests over the summer in the northwestern region of Galicia, where the residents of this small town, which gets really, really overwhelmed with cars and caravans in the summertime, they basically decided that they were just going to walk back and forth across a zebra crossing for about 20 minutes to bring the traffic to the whole, and then they caused these huge traffic jams, and then they just kind of like slipped away before the police could arrive. It was quite funny.
And looking at islands, you've got the Canary Islands where there were again protests over the summer about tourism. Looking for solutions. Yes, okay, islands, it's viable really to implement potential number caps because of the transport associated. But is it really possible over sort of mainland Spain, given it's in sort of Schengen zone?
To put caps on destinations?
Yeah.
No, well, I mean, obviously it's very difficult. There's a nice example that's been in the news this week of the Sierras Islands, which are again up in Galicia. Galicia is such a beautiful part of Spain. There's so much there to see. But obviously, we're talking about small, fragile islands in terms of their ecosystem, and a cap has been in place there for a while. And obviously, when you're talking about an island, then yes, like you say, that is feasible. But it's going to be more difficult to restrict access to major city destinations. The things that you can do are what, for example, Barcelona is already talking about doing, which is to restrict very specific elements of tourism, which, for example, the cruise ships. The cruise ships have long been a problem in Barcelona. They've long been a major issue because the cruise ships arrive, the passengers disembark, they spend about 4 hours wandering around the streets, not necessarily spending any money, kind of clogging up the streets, and then they leave. And that's something that Barcelona is taking action over, because it is one of the key factors that has contributed to this overcrowding that the residents of the Catalan capital have been struggling with.
And looking at another measure apart from visitor caps, because a big part of this across Europe is housing and the lack of housing and what Airbnb has done to housing markets. Is it potentially better to sort of ban the sort of short-let culture, as some cities have done? New York has done it, for instance, to try to reset things.
Well, that's what Barcelona wants to do. The new Barcelona mayor has said that he's going to phase out. He's just going to stop renewing licenses, basically, so that within a sort of time frame of about 8 to 10 years, there won't be any Airbnb style accommodation left in the city. Whether that is feasible, whether that will work, is yet to be seen. I was doing a story about this recently, and I spoke to various heads of hotel associations, and basically, one of the people I spoke to said something really interesting. It's so obvious, but the problem is that the Airbnb model has brought tourists into areas where people live. Previously, tourists would go to visit a destination and they would be in a specific area for them, whether it's a hotel or a resort or apartment blocks that are for tourists. And the problem is that Airbnb has brought, let's say young visitors, I don't know, from the United States who want to, party and have a good time and stay up late and make a noise into apartments that are right next door to an 80-year-old Spanish widow who's been living in that building for her whole life. And it's not just the noise and the antisocial behaviour that's an issue there, but probably also that lady might eventually be forced out of her apartment because there is such a thirst for more of these properties because they are obviously so profitable to the owners.
Simon Hunter, thank you very much. Complex issue, and it'll be interesting to see whether or not over the winter season they do implement measures like we have discussed. And that is it for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Hassan Anderson. Our researchers were Gunnar Gronlid and Sana Jumani, and our studio manager was Lily Austin. The Briefing is back at the same time tomorrow. If you've enjoyed the show, please do subscribe to the podcast and leave us a review. Let us know what you've enjoyed listening to and what you would like to hear more of. And you can email me about anything we've discussed, vm@monocle.com. I'm Vincent McAviney. Goodbye, and thank you for listening.